Welcome to Echoes of Fear, your haven for the most terrifying mysteries and the most disturbing true crime stories. In today's video, I bring you real-life crime tales that challenge human comprehension and continue to haunt our minds even after time has passed. Get ready for a dark and unsettling journey where the line between reality and fear becomes ever thinner. If you have the courage, settle in, because today's stories will haunt your mind, and who knows, maybe even your dreams. Story 1. The Fall. Date who knew too much. On January 16, 2016, Rachel Thompson, a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer from Austin, Texas, decided to meet a man she had been chatting with on OkCupid. His name was Chris Carter, and after weeks of pleasant conversation, they agreed to meet at Cafe Caffeine, located on West 6th Street, for coffee at 7 p.m. Rachel had no reason to feel anxious. Chris seemed friendly, funny, and easygoing, and they shared similar interests, particularly in art and travel. The date started off well with light conversation about their favorite cities and their shared love for hiking. As the evening progressed, Rachel felt a growing sense of comfort and attraction. However, as the night wore on, Chris began asking more personal questions. At first it was small things, what her childhood was like, who her closest friends were, but then the questions became strange. He started asking, "Have you ever felt like someone is always watching you?" Rachel thought it was a weird, philosophical question, but she laughed it off. After about an hour, Chris suggested they walk around the area near Congress Avenue Bridge. Rachel agreed, though something about the way he suggested it made her uneasy. They walked along the sidewalk, passing tourists taking photos of the bats emerging from the bridge, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Chris kept looking around, almost as if he was scanning the area. Around 9 p.m. they stopped on a quiet side street off East Riverside Drive. Chris suddenly became very intense, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Rachel. "You know," he said slowly, "I know where you live, I know where you work, and I know who your best friend is." Rachel's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the information. She had never mentioned her address or workplace to him. Panicking, Rachel quickly excused herself, claiming she had an early meeting the next morning. Chris didn't try to stop her, but as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. That night, when Rachel returned to her apartment, she double-checked the locks and checked her windows for any signs of someone watching. The next day, Rachel received a message from Chris. "I'll see you soon, Rachel. I already know where you live. You should be more careful with who you meet online." Terrified, she reported the incident to the police. When they investigated, they found that Chris Carter was actually a man named John Miller, with a history of stalking women he met online. He had been using fake profiles to get personal information and track his victims. Though John was eventually arrested, Rachel's unease never fully left her. To this day, she never meets anyone online without verifying their identity, and she avoids walking alone at night, always feeling as though someone might be following her. Story 2. The Blind Date from Hell. In June 3, 2019, Megan Clark, a 30-year-old marketing manager living in Portland, Oregon, agreed to go on a blind date set up by a mutual friend. The man she was meeting was named David Lewis, and he was described as charming and down-to-earth. They arranged to meet at Pine Street Market around 7 p.m. The location was a popular food hall with plenty of people around, so Megan felt comfortable meeting there. When Megan arrived, she spotted David immediately. He was standing near the entrance wearing a button-down shirt and a friendly smile. She approached him, introduced herself, and they sat down at a table near the back of the market. They talked about their jobs, their hobbies, and their families, but Megan noticed that David kept glancing around the room nervously. After about 30 minutes, David suggested they leave the market and go for a walk around Portland's waterfront park. Megan was a little hesitant, but she agreed since it was still light out, and the park was relatively safe. As they walked along the water, Megan started to notice something strange. David kept looking over his shoulder as if he was expecting someone. His unease was starting to make her uncomfortable, but she brushed it off as nerves. Around 8:45 p.m., they reached a more secluded part of the park, away from the main walking paths. It was here that David's behavior took an even stranger turn. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been watching you for a while now. I know where you live, Megan. I know what kind of car you drive." Megan froze. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to laugh it off, but her voice wavered with anxiety. David took a step closer to her. "I've been following you for weeks. I know everything about you. I've seen you go to the gym. I know your route home from work." He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, almost predatory. Megan's heart pounded as she realized the true danger of the situation. She backed away, attempting to put some space between them. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling. David reached for her arm, but she jerked away and ran toward the nearest exit of the park, not daring to look back. She ran until she reached a more populated area and immediately called the police. David had already disappeared by the time officers arrived. They later discovered that David Lewis had been using social media to track his date's movements and had a history of obsessive behavior toward women he met through friends. He had been stalking Megan for weeks before the blind date. David was eventually arrested, but the experience left Megan shaken. She installed security cameras around her home and became cautious about meeting people, especially when she didn't know them well. To this day, she feels uneasy when she walks through Portland's waterfront park at night, remembering the man who watched her every move. Story 3. The Man from the Coffee Shop. On March 22, 2017, Olivia Harris, a 25-year-old writer from Seattle, Washington, agreed to meet a man she had been talking to on Tinder. His name was Mark Davis, and after weeks of pleasant conversations, they finally decided to meet in person. They agreed to meet at a cozy, well-lit cafe called Cafe Vita on Capitol Hill at 8:12 p.m. Olivia felt comfortable with Mark, as he seemed like a nice guy, polite, well-spoken, and funny. When Olivia arrived, she spotted him immediately at the table by the window. He stood up to greet her with a smile, and they began chatting over coffee. The conversation flowed easily, and Olivia felt like they were getting along really well. Mark seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say, and they shared stories about their careers, their families, and their favorite books. Around 9:30 p.m., Mark suggested they take a walk through the nearby volunteer park, a large public park located near the cafe. Olivia, who enjoyed late-night walks, agreed. They strolled through the park, chatting casually, but Olivia couldn't help but notice that Mark seemed to be acting a little strange. He kept glancing around almost nervously, and his smile seemed a bit too wide, too forced. As they walked deeper into the park, the air grew colder, and the streetlights became more spaced out. Olivia began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Suddenly, Mark stopped walking and turned to her, his face now serious. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been watching you for a while now. I know where you live, Olivia." Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mark's smile faded, and his tone turned colder. "I've been following you on Instagram. I know where you go to work, where you get coffee every morning. You shouldn't be so public with your life." Olivia froze, her mind racing. This wasn't just a strange comment, it was a threat. She had never told him where she lived or worked, and yet he knew. She took a step back. "I need to go," she said, her voice shaky. Mark grabbed her wrist suddenly, too tightly. "No," he said, his grip tightening. "You're not going anywhere. You're mine now." Panic flooded Olivia's chest, and she yanked her arm free, stumbling backward. "Stay away from me!" she shouted, her voice trembling. Without looking back, Olivia ran through the park, desperately trying to find the nearest exit. She didn't stop until she reached a busy street and saw other people nearby. She called the police, and they quickly arrived to search the area, but Mark was gone. They later found that Mark had been using social media to stalk women, and Olivia was just another victim in his pattern. Although Mark was never caught that night, the police later found him and discovered he had a criminal history of stalking. Olivia, shaken by the experience, never used social media the same way again. Even today, she avoids walking alone through Volunteer Park, still haunted by the memory of the man who seemed to know everything about her. Story 4. the date with the man who didn't let her leave. On August 5, 2018, Hannah Williams, a 29-year-old nurse from Chicago, Illinois, agreed to meet a man named Brian Keller after matching with him on Hinge. After a few days of texting and phone calls, they decided to meet for dinner at a local Italian restaurant called Piccolo Sogno in River West, a trendy neighborhood in Chicago, around 7:30 p.m. Brian seemed kind and thoughtful on their phone calls, and Hannah felt comfortable sharing stories about their jobs and their childhoods. However, as the evening went on, Brian started to act a bit strangely. He began asking questions that were much too personal for a first date. Questions about her, past relationships, her family secrets, and even her personal fears. Hannah tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, but Brian kept circling back to these uncomfortable questions. Around 9 p.m. after dinner, Brian suggested they go for a walk along the nearby Chicago Riverwalk, which was popular for its scenic views and quiet atmosphere. Hannah, despite feeling a little uncomfortable, agreed, thinking a walk would be a nice way to clear the air. As they walked along the river, the conversation grew darker. Brian began talking about how he hated how easy it was for people to lie, and he made strange comments about knowing when someone was hiding something. Hannah felt uneasy but didn't want to be rude. Suddenly, Brian stopped walking and turned to face her. "You're hiding something from me, aren't you?" he asked, his voice cold. "I can see it in your eyes." Hannah laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "No, I'm not hiding anything. You're just being paranoid." But Brian wasn't laughing. His eyes narrowed. "I don't think you're telling me the truth, Hannah," he said, his tone low and threatening. "And I don't like being lied to." The air felt thick with tension as Brian took a step closer to her. Hannah felt trapped. She needed to leave, but something about his presence made her feel physically unable to move. When she tried to step back, he grabbed her arm, holding her firmly in place. "I'm not letting you go," he said, his grip tightening. "So you're not leaving until we talk this through." Hannah's heart raced as she struggled to free herself. "Let me go, Brian," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm leaving." But Brian wasn't letting go. At that moment, Hannah's phone buzzed. Her best friend Emily had texted her asking how the date was going. That small distraction gave Hannah the moment she needed. She jerked her arm free and sprinted toward the nearest street, yelling for help as she ran. Thankfully, a passerby noticed and called the police. When they arrived, Brian had already disappeared. Hannah was later able to get a restraining order against him after it was discovered that Brian had a history of violent behavior and had been previously arrested for similar incidents. Though Brian was eventually arrested and convicted for harassment, Hannah could never forget the terror she felt that night. To this day, she avoids walking alone by the Chicago Riverwalk, always watching her back, just in case the man who wouldn't let her leave is still out there. Well, folks, those were today's disturbing stories. I hope they've stirred your emotions and made you reflect on the dark mysteries that surround us. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chilling tales. And of course, if you have the courage, we'll see you in the next video here on Echoes of Fear. Stay alert and sweet dreams, if you can sleep.